Why paper? Basically, all I wanted was a way of creating a completely custom set, as filmmaking can be expensive if you want to go down that route. So paper is kind of the ideal thing to go with, as you can pretty much make anything if you have the time and can be bothered to do it. I also went for paper because when I was a kid I used to make little paper action figures because I would always complain about the manoeuvrability of toys. Here's one I made earlier. Also, the benefit of making these is I could make whoever I want and wasn't limited to what's on the shelf, plus they were free. Obviously the characters ended up a bit different to the toys I made, but they were the initial inspiration. It's important to get all of your shots planned before you make them, since you'll need multiple variations. Here are all the different versions of the detective that I needed, and here is also what's on the other side of them, since some shots required the character turning around. I'd start with one that I'd use for reference, and once it's drawn then cut out, I'd copy it on the other side, giving me a character that can do a shot like this. From here, I'd always try and recreate that one, as you don't want to be recreating a recreation of a recreation like a drawn version of Chinese whispers. Really, you want them to look as identical as possible. Also, each character will need limbs depending on what they're doing. So you make the hands to scale and then make the arm a lot longer so it can be puppeteered. Most of them were just simple, change what the hand is doing, and the only fairly complicated one was the smoking, since it needed a tiny little cigarette slotted between the fingers. I also coloured in the end in red so I could later colour correct it to a more ember-like orange. But the first props I made were the chairs. They were pretty simple, as I'd get an L-shaped piece of paper that is scaled to the size of the characters. Then for the legs I'd wrap a piece of paper around a pencil and glue it shut. Then once it's dry I'd glue it to the bottom of the chair. For the bar stools, instead of an L shape I'd cut out a little circle and draw on a little bit of detail on the top. For the tables I made a couple different designs. The one that was seen the least, or really wasn't seen at all for obvious reasons, was this circular one. The coasters I added, while not being heavy, were too much for the paper. I could have probably supported it, but since it wasn't in any shots I thought it wasn't really worth wasting my time on it. For this table I cut out a shape that looked like this, and after a bit of folding and gluing I got what I wanted. Then I added the cocktail sticks for sturdiness, and if I needed I could attach some white tack to the legs to stick it to the floor, or just give it some extra weight to reduce it moving around. Then we have the pool table. All it is a rectangle with the same sort of legs as the chairs, and then added a 2D rectangle that's a little bit bigger glued on top. It's nothing fancy, but the extra layers give it more of a pop and therefore more visually appealing. Other props I made were the glasses, which are just shorter versions of the chair legs, the knife with and without the blood on it, and the wallet, which I thought about making it a bit bigger so I could get more detail onto it. However, I thought it looked funnier to scale with a lack of information on it. Constructing the set, I first started with this wall, which also has the most detail. The way I did it was by starting with a blank wall that has a simple wallpaper design, but to switch up a bit and make it better to look at, I added in the imperfections like the cracked mirror, the rips, and even a bit of mould where the wallpaper is peeling away. Then for all the shells, I would draw them, cut them out and stick it onto the wall with a bit of white tack to give it a more 3D look. Again, I switched up the designs, adding different bottles, some glasses, shot glasses, a mousetrap next to the hole in the wall, a photo of the bartender, a locked box or something, and even a gun that's barely visible. Try and tell a story behind the environment if you can, as there's so many films that I watch where the set is just lazily designed and just feels like they arrived at a place and started shooting. For the bar itself, I cut out a rectangle and used some cardboard to keep it sturdy. Then my acoustic foam fell off the wall and flattened the entire thing. Thankfully I wanted the set to look grubby and run down, so the creases in the paper fit pretty well. I decided to use cocktail sticks to then help prop up the bar a bit better, and they worked out fantastically. For the details, I made some coasters, made a drinks machine, added some marks where people didn't use a coaster, and also some knife marks where somebody was playing 5-finger fillet. I also did some drawers at the back that nobody will ever see, but it's better than leaving it blank in case I did want the camera to look back there, as it's harder to draw it on when it's already up. For the floor I went for a wooden look that's a bit grubby, with some missing nails and cracks in the boards. The dirt was all accidental, as I had the problem with one of my cats jumping onto the set so she could get onto the windowsill, and because I had the set separated into halves to make it possible to film without walls in the way, this meant that only one half had mud all over it. It was a simple fix that just meant me going into the garden and rubbing my hands in the dirt like a crazy person. Another little detail I added that nobody will see is this little mat behind the bar, and underneath it is a safe. You see, I'd planned to make a series using this style, and this short was just a way of seeing how viable it is to make, and it's not viable at all, as this has taken me about 10 months to finish. Admittedly, I haven't spent all of my time on it, but it's enough time to make me utterly sick of looking at paper. It kind of shows a bit, as I didn't go super crazy with the rest of the walls. I went fairly simple, adding some photos and paintings. This painting in particular is a reference to one in my local pub that always creeps me out because the guy in it has really dead eyes. But again, to switch up the look a bit, I did a photo that's fallen off and cracked, leaving an empty space on the wall, plus another empty space where somebody has removed a photo, perhaps because of some bad blood. Who knows? I've intentionally left it for interpretation, as I find it more fun having things not spelt out. out for you, lets you put your own meaning onto it. Over in this corner I made a condom machine named Johnny's Johnny's and a jukebox that someone has vandalised to either say Dick's Box or Dyke's Box, both spelt incorrectly to give the impression of people who go here are idiots. Then in between them is the toilets, which usually should be called a restroom since this is set in America, but since this is more of an English design for a bar, toilets is probably more appropriate. Very easy to make as it's just a flap with darkness behind it. I did the same for the front door except without the darkness behind it. Instead I used the wall in my room, and since it's blue I can remove it from the shot to replace it with the background. I did this with the window too, and you can also notice a little cut in the cross section which happened on the last square I was cutting out. Though again, since I was going for a run-down look, I was fine with it. Bit of glue and a cocktail stick and it's good as new-ish. Then I popped on a windowsill to make it 3D. We also have the ceiling, which I did a very light bit of scribbling on it, just so it wasn't a blank piece of paper. Then for the fan I stuck this onto a piece of cardboard that was attached to a cocktail stick. The cocktail stick would then go through the paper so I could give it a little bit of a spin. Once that shot was done, I cut off a section for this shot, just so it's a little bit more obvious that it's a broken ceiling fan rather than just some random X on the screen. I also made an exterior set comprised of this wall, which there isn't really anything to talk about that hasn't been brought up already. This road, and also some buildings for in the background. It didn't need to be 3D since it'll all be out of focus in the background, however I did make a bit of a curb just because I felt like it. Though the piece de la resistance is the opening exterior shot, which I will break down very quick as it's pretty simple. These are made out of basic paper boxes if you cut out a shape like this. The signs are just cut out pieces of paper that are then stuck on. The trash can is a short chair leg that is squashed down creating a lid. The fence is a strip of paper with the bottom folded over so it can be glued. That is paper coloured in then scrunched up. The overpass is a piece of cardboard cut into a curve with paper on top and it's held with 2 paper cylinders. Easy peasy. Oh, there's also the newsroom, but that one's pretty self-explanatory. Right, that is all the crafting I had to do, so let's have a look at filming. I shot this on my Blackmagic Pocket 4K and this shot was done on my Olympus 17mm lens, while the rest was shot on my Olympus 60mm macro lens, since most of this required the camera to be incredibly close up since it's all small, and macro lenses allow you to focus on something super close. I also cranked up the aperture as this would increase the depth of field, making everything feel larger. This does require a lot more light, but I had that covered. Unfortunately, a downside of shooting at a high aperture is if you have dust spots on your sensor, they will appear like a dark splodge on the screen. I gave the sensor a good clean, but I didn't get all of them. However, the way I got around this was by creating another layer and putting a mask on an area with a similar look and lighting. Then just move it over and try to blend it in. There's probably software that will do it automatically, but I don't have any downloaded, and since it's a static shot, it's very easy to fix. The way I shot this was by having a piece of paper that would go down through the desk that I'd wiggled to give the newsreader some movement. Then for the advert, I shot all of this on a green background, and each individual piece was attached to a wooden kebab skewer. I cut it up to make the timing right for the dialogue, adding some dissolves to make it smoother, removed the green and brown pixels, and then used a series of masks from previous frames to patch up the holes. This shot was actually filmed in 2 goes, filmed the detective with the background removed and the American on his own. The way I got the movement was by slightly blowing on him to give the shot a little bit of life rather than being static. Now let's get the faces out of the way since they're in almost all of the shots. I used a mouth shut and then 3 different variations of an opening mouth. Originally I used cross dissolves to piece these together, but it ended up messing with the tracking software I used, so instead I increased the length of each mouth and changed the opacity using keyframes, which ended up fixing my problem. It's not the most elegant way of doing it, but I didn't want to learn a whole new animation software just for this. Next I added the eyes and nose. Then I placed the pupils and eyebrows, animating them to fit with the dialogue. Once these were done, I would grab a portion of the face using a mask and place this under the mouth, because I used these red dots as tracking markers, and when the mouth was shut you'd see them. The software I use for tracking is Pixel Studio's Auto Tracker, which is a little bit janky, but with a bit of fiddling around it gets the job done. It did however lengthen my loading times massively. It would take an hour to render when I turned on the computer, and then like 5 minutes if I made a slight variation. There are probably ways of fixing the render times, but I was so far into this when the problems came up that I didn't want to fiddle with the software settings in case I completely destroy everything. So should anyone copy this format, try and find a better way of doing the faces. This one I attached the arm to a thin bit of wire and then used the other side of the wire to hold the whiskey glass like chopsticks. The hand would come into frame, I'd release my grip and then pull it away without showing the wire. Then the follow-up shot I attached the glass using white tack and puppeteered the hand toward the mouth. Then I would use masks so the hand would go in front of the face. This shot is usually made using a split diopter lens, which I don't have. Instead I filmed the background separately to the knife and then added a blur to one side of the background, creating the illusion of depth. Without the blur it looks like this, which just feels a bit odd. For the spilled drink I dabbed my finger with a little bit of water and then let it drip onto the paper. This way makes the most of using the environment experiment, and if you have a unique concept, it's always better to roll with it. I wish I did more stuff like this, like burning the paper or more rips in it, but decided against it as I would have done it in the series that I'm no longer doing. Now, the way I got characters to point was by using the thin wire again. I'd attach the arm and then bend it 90 degrees so it would be pressed up against the back of the character. This would give it a little bit more stability, and when everything is small like this, you need stability. There's a lot of parts where my hand was getting a bit shaky as I had to hold it out in awkward positions for a few minutes to get the shot. Here is a good example of using masks to cover up things. As you can see, I used a wooden kebab skewer to keep him standing. Grab an area with a similar look to what you'd be covering, and in this case it's a blank wall. Match the lighting, and then from there it's just micro adjustments to blend everything in. Filmmaking really is about taking your time to solve problems, be that technical or even in the plot, which is what I really enjoy about it. A way I use problem solving for the plot is in the interrogation part. Instead of being a boring shot reverse shot format for each of the characters, I switched it up a bit. The bartender is a shot reverse shot, but it's a short scene. The veteran has these shots where someone is pointing at something and it adds these little breaks to the dialogue to give some time to digest the silliness of what's happening. It also makes the segment a lot more visually appealing. Then for the Mexican, I added the flashbacks as it's another way of changing the visual storytelling, as it also shows the detective as more of a drunken idiot with a bit of drool coming out of his mouth. Now for the exterior shots. I did a bit of colour correcting to make it bluer, which is a common thing in filming to show nighttime. Part of me thinks I went a bit far with the blueness, since it's supposed to be a noir style, but as long as it looks good to me, then I'm happy. Then for the smoke, what I did for this was smoke in a very dark room. This way I could remove the background through its luminance. However, it didn't remove the background perfectly, leaving these dark areas around the smoke, and so I bumped up the exposure on the shadows, then lowered the opacity a tad to make it a bit see-through like smoke. Problem solving at its finest. For this push-in, I used my Edelkrone slider, and good god did this take ages. I found out when I was filming my coffee video that the slider with the camera on it is too heavy for my tripod, so it would end up dipping down when it extends too far, and because I'm an idiot I haven't brought a new tripod yet that can handle this. I managed to get some decent shots that I was able to stabilise, but the one I liked the most was quite out of focus at the start. I was proper impressed by the fix I did, to the point where I can't even notice I tampered with the image. I grabbed a frame from another shot that matches the start, then went frame by frame distorting the image to match the original footage, and then finally making it fade out to the original clip. It looks brilliant, but it's really taught me to expect things to go wrong. The same thing happened with the push into the Mexican, and I did the same method again, looking great. Though something I want to bring up with the design here is the slight change to his look during the sequence. To show the detective is a racist, in his retelling of what happened, the Mexican has a more cholo look to him, which is kind of a stereotypical Mexican look. For this shot I had the base clip with nothing coming out, then I filmed paper coming out of a toilet roll tube. Using gravity, the paper falls out of the tube and onto the camera lens. Then I removed the brown pixels, but I had the same issue I had with the smoke. So I did the exact same thing, brightening the shadows to match the colour of paper. I then tracked this onto the cup, going through frame by frame and changing the exposure to match the shot. For the stabbing, I started with the knife in the chest and pulled it out. Then in post I reversed the shot and patched up the holes using masks. And that is all the different sort of shots I did. Everything else is techniques I'd already done, which I'm sure you can figure out now, and others I'm sure are pretty self-explanatory. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown that shows I'm far from an experienced filmmaker, and hopefully it was informative.